for many years, a large course called Russia Since 1917. There are about 300 to 400 kids in the course, and they are kids, each year. I can no longer speak as though they have even approximately the same time reference I have in my head. I will say, now you all remember how excited everybody was when Gorbachev came to power. They don't. They were born after the Soviet Union ended. And therefore, it's a whole new self-orientation to teach this, to lecture. I don't know whether I'm teaching them anything or not, I don't know. But to talk to them, everything has to be context. I'm not sure when their knowledge of history begins. I really, very seriously, not sure how much history they know. What they do know, they seem to have gotten from the internet, which means in all likelihood it's less than accurate. So there's a lot of starting from scratch, which I don't have to do here tonight. Therefore, all I need to remind you, as the premise of my talk, is though Russia, since the end of the Soviet Union, has been taken from the forefront of the headlines by war, Iraq, Iran, Afghanistan, by all manner of other international affairs, the cold reality is, whether our political class is aware of it or not, and I think generally speaking it is not aware of it, that America's #1 national security concern remains Russia. The road to American national security of the kind that we'd like to leave to our kids and our grandkids runs through Moscow. And you know the reasons for this, though other generations do not know the reasons, but I'll briefly remind you. Only Russia still has the nuclear weapons that could destroy all of us. Russia has immense natural resources, not only oil and gas, of which it's become the primary exporter now in the world, but it has all sorts of metals and diamonds, and they say something that will be immensely important in the future, vast quantities of fresh water, which I don't know exactly why, but people tell us is going to be increasingly important. And then there's the location of Russia. Russia, as all of you know, remains, even after the Soviet Union, the largest territorial country in the world. It no longer has an enormous population as we do. It's shrunk by half. But geographically, it's the largest country in the world. That's not as important as where it's located. It's located at the very crossroads between Western, sometimes Judeo-Christian civilization and Islamic civilization. So to the extent that we're now living in a world with either friction or war between civilization, Russia geographically is on the barricade. Still more, Russia has approximately 20 million Islamic citizens of its own. Now, the stability of the world, or peace in the world, clearly depends in some way on how we relate to the Islamic world, and the Islamic world relates to us. That too runs through Russia. It runs through Russia. What's wrong, David?
Just gotta move that away from you a little bit.
Well, I'll just move closer to it. Just tell me to back off of it. Then there's Russia's capacity, even though it can't project its power the way the Soviet Union did, to be a factor for better or worse in resolving international conflicts in which the United States has a very large stake. The one, of course, we know about every day is Iran. Iran is very dependent on Russia for certain things, and therefore Russia has some sway in Tehran. Not as much as we think it does, but some. Russia's role in Afghanistan can be immense, for better or worse. And this is true even in Latin America and throughout the Middle East. So there will be no American national security worth the name unless we have a cooperative strategic security relationship with Russia. That's the way it was when all of us in this room were growing up. Our political class has forgotten it. And if you want to know who forgot it first, it was Bill Clinton. But that's part of the story I want to tell you tonight. Here's the problem, though. When Obama became president in January 2009, the United States was in a state of virtual new Cold War with post-Soviet Russia. There was no cooperation, there was no dialogue, there weren't even any more what all of us had expected to be for 50 years, nuclear arms agreements that provided for controls, reductions, and inspection on both sides. All that had been abolished by the Bush administration. Still worse, and I want you to think about this for a moment. In August 2008, just over 2 years ago, there occurred the single most dangerous American-Russian conflict since the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. It was called the Russian-Georgian War. You all remember that, right? When the leader of Georgia attacked Russian peacekeepers and Russian citizens in his own country, Georgia, and Russia sent its troops across the border and virtually destroyed the Georgian army and backed the secessionist aspirations of two Georgian provinces, which with Russian support are now independent states, though almost nobody recognizes them. That was in reality, cold reality, a proxy American-Russian war. We, the United States, Washington, had created the Georgian army, armed it, trained it. American minders were traveling with its forces when it moved into the Georgian-Russian border. And though we do not know the truth, there is reason to think that Saakashvili, when he started the war, believed he had Washington's support. Suffice it to say that Condi Rice, then the Secretary of State, was in Tbilisi 6 days before the war. If she didn't know what was coming, she should have been impeached. If she told Saakashvili it was okay, she should have been impeached. Because within a day or two, Cheney was urging the use of nuclear weapons against the Russian forces. We now know. And at a minimum, there was a discussion in the White House about at least sending NATO bombers, as we had done in Serbia, to bomb the Russian forces that were in Georgia. So that's how close we came to war with Russia. That's how close. How did this happen? You all will remember that in the period from 1988 to 1991, Reagan, our president, Gorbachev, the president then of the Soviet Union, and the first President Bush told us repeatedly that the Cold War was over. Everybody remembers that, right? When Reagan left office in January 1989, he wrote in his diary, the Cold War is over. And Gorbachev and Bush then said repeatedly at Malta, in Berlin, when they joined together to drive Saddam out of Kuwait, you remember that? The Russians backed that American war, even though Iraq had been a Russian client state. They told us repeatedly, this is proof the Cold War is over, capped by the agreement, Soviet-American, to reunite Germany. So how did it happen 20 years later that we were not only in a new Cold War with Russia, but had come that close to hot war with Russia? What went wrong? The answer in Washington, and virtually without exception, except maybe The Nation magazine, which my boundlessly wise wife edits, is that it was Russia's fault. That this opportunity after 1991 for a post-Soviet, post-Cold War partnership, American-Russian, was lost. And in particular, it was the fault of Vladimir Putin, who became Russian president in January 2010. According to this story, which virtually every major American media outlet adheres to, in the 1990s, under Clinton and the first post-Soviet Russian president, Boris Yeltsin, there was a post-Soviet American-Russian partnership. But then Putin came, and with his anti-democratic, imperialistic policies, ruined it. And that led to the situation that Obama inherited when he became president. It ain't so. That is not, by any fair historical account, what happened. In my recent book, Soviet Fates and Lost Alternatives, in the last chapter, which I call Who Lost the Post-Soviet Peace, I give a different view. It has not been popular because almost the entire American intellectual political class has a stake, institutional or personal, in the orthodox explanation. But the authentic explanation is that the opportunity for an American-Russian post-Soviet, post-Cold War peace was not lost in Moscow, not lost by Putin, but was lost in Washington by Bill Clinton in the 1990s. And not necessarily by Clinton personally, but by his presidency and the people who were advising him. The Clinton administration made a decision in about 1993-4 to treat post-Soviet Russia as a defeated nation on the grounds that we, the United States, had won the Cold War and Russia had lost it. And therefore, policymaking toward Russia should be analogous to American policymaking toward defeated Germany and Japan after World War II. What did this mean? And you'll remember it if you think back to the 90s. That means that legions of Americans should rush off to Russia to teach the Russians how to be market consumers and producers, how to be Democrats, how to vote, how to organize political parties, how to edit newspapers. Americans were ensconced in governmental offices writing new Russian legislations and all this stuff. It also meant that we made demands for unilateral concessions from Russia, which, because Yeltsin was weak and drunk and frightened, he gave. It also meant that we felt we could break any promise we made to the new Russian state, which we did repeatedly. The result was, of course, by the end of the 90s, to badly anger and disillusion the Russian political class, which had been pro-American, too pro-American, a little bit nutty pro-American, in 1991, 1992. But there was an inevitable backlash against this kind of American behavior. And its name was Vladimir Putin, who came to power 10 years later in 2000, not after the end of the Soviet Union. I will long remember the conversation that my wife, Katrina vanden Heuvel, and I had with a man whose name you may remember, Grigory Yavlinsky. He was thought to be the most democratic post-Soviet political leader, politician. He had a political party that was in the parliament. It's no longer in the parliament. He was fairly influential, and he was very popular in the United States. He did projects with Harvard, which, of course, how much more American can you get than that? And he spoke excellent English, and he was pretty good looking, and he was very popular. But he became, by the end of the 90s, in despair over Clinton's policy toward Russia. And one night, drinking late at night, 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning at a friend's house, he said to Katrina and to me, this is going to end very badly for America and for Russia. And about 2 years later, when we saw him again, he looked at me and he waved his finger and he said, I told you. The face of what I was talking about is Putin. You created Putin. Stop whining about him. And to the extent that there's a kind of generalization that can be made, that is true. Because Putin, once in power, began to toughen up Russian foreign policy. No more concessions, two-way streets, no more supplicant posturing toward the United States. Now, when Obama campaigned and began to speak of the need for a reset, as he called it, in Washington's relations with Moscow, I thought that's really good. It means he understands something went wrong. Something was lost in the 90s, and that we were in a state of Cold War, and that American security, because he was now thinking Afghanistan, because he'd made a commitment to fight that war, wasn't his, but he made it his. He realized he needed Russia's help. But for whatever reason, he realized that he had to try to improve relations with Russia. So I was hopeful that he would lead us back toward the lost opportunity for partnership. I also hoped that he would be what Russians call a new thinker, like Gorbachev was a new thinker. And to a certain extent, even Ronald Reagan, toward the end of his presidency, became a new thinker about Russia. That is, a leader who would transcend the orthodoxy of his own political class and force or persuade his own political class to change its thinking. I began to despair, though, when Obama became president, when he appointed as his foreign policy advisors, almost without exception, people from the Clinton administration, beginning with Mrs. Clinton, who was by far, in regard to Russia policy, not the worst. So essentially what Obama did is, while calling for a new Russia policy, made his Russian advisors people who had created the old policy. Now, at a certain age, it ain't easy to change your mind. And if you're a public figure, it's virtually impossible. People just in political life don't change their minds and their policies. They defend their past political biographies. So I began to worry, and that leads to the question that I've given us tonight: is Obama's reset working? Obama says it is. In fact, in his State of the Union address a couple weeks ago, he said, "We have successfully," I think I'm quoting him exactly, "reset relations with Russia." That was about the only thing in foreign policy he can lay claim to as an achievement, and he laid claim to the nation, to the Congress that night. He has made his partner, somebody his own age, Russian President Dmitry Medvedev. And Medvedev has embraced the reset also. And he too insists that it's a great success. So the leaders on both sides, along with the media, say it's been good, it's worked. And we can all now go back to eating our food, drink a little more wine, and go home assured. And in a way, it almost seems to be true. There's no more harsh dialogue, or far less. There's discourse. There's cooperation, quite a bit on Afghanistan, not as much as both sides claim on Iran. And in December, just a couple months ago, both parliaments ratified a new nuclear reductions treaty called the New START. So things look pretty good. And it looks like Obama, in this case at least, is laying fair claim to an achievement. I think this is all mirrors. I think that the reset remains very far from anything approximating a real partnership, or even the basis for a future partnership. I think the reset politically is highly unstable and limited. And here are the reasons I think this is so. It's unfolding for about a year and a half now in the context of two utterly conflicting narratives about why the reset was necessary in the first place. That is, two conflicting versions, one coming from Moscow, one from Washington, about who was responsible for the bad relationship that began in the 90s and that Obama said he wanted to reset. Medvedev and Putin, the two leaders of Russia, have said over and over and over again, it's almost never reported in the American press, and I quote, "Russia has been repeatedly deceived and betrayed by Washington." Now just think about that. Russia, sometimes they say we, have been repeatedly, not once, repeatedly, be deceived and betrayed by Washington. What they mean is that we, our government, broke four fundamental promises to Russia since the end of the Soviet Union. Or, if not broke promises, behaved in a way that the Russians regard as obscenely lacking in gratitude. The first broken promise, as surely you all know, was that the first Bush promised Gorbachev in 1990 and 1991 that if Gorbachev would agree to the reunification of Germany, and a united Germany as a member of NATO, that NATO, in the words of then Secretary of State James Baker, would not expand eastward 1 inch. And on this basis, repeated by the German government to Gorbachev, Gorbachev agreed to the united Germany and NATO. Today, NATO's on Russia's borders. The 3 Baltic states, which border Russia, are members of NATO. Washington remains intent on bringing Georgia into NATO. It borders Russia. On bringing Ukraine, which is virtually part of Russia, into NATO. This is more than a broken promise. This was a sacred commitment. Washington's answer is the answer of a used car dealer. I hope there are no used car dealers here. My uncle was a used car dealer. Well, he should have got it in writing. And it is true, Gorbachev should have made it codify that commitment in a treaty, and he didn't. And he's faulted for this in Russia very often. But nonetheless, when your government, your president, gives the nation's word on behalf of all of us, none of us feel good about them subsequently breaking the word, particularly if there was no provocation. I mean, if Russia had attacked Germany, then you'd say, well, okay, but it didn't do anything. The second thing is that Russia, after the end of the Soviet Union, was promised repeatedly that NATO would take no strategic military measures in Russia's backyard without Russia's agreement. And you will recall that Clinton, who expanded NATO in 1994, also broke this promise in 1999 when Clinton, though he used NATO troops, but he had no authorization from the UN, bombed Serbia. You remember the bombing of Serbia. Purportedly to make Milosevic stop mistreating Kosovo, which is now a narco state that trades in human organs. Lovely piece of work we created. The bombing of Serbia shocked Russia. The Serbs are Slav people. More than that, they are members of the same Orthodox Church as Russians. They have centuries and centuries of cultural, spiritual, and affinity. This was like somebody beating up your little brother down at the end of the block. And you remember we rained a lot of bombs on them, and they had no defenses at all. And after 70 days or so, they surrendered. Then think back to what happened right after 9/11. You remember that the first person to call the second George Bush was Putin. They were now looking at each other's souls, remember, and liking each other. And Putin said, George, we're with you. This is horrible. Anything you want, we're ready to help you and give you. And they did. When we sent American land forces into Afghanistan, a very, very risky ground war venture, a terrain with which we were unfamiliar, Russia gave us, in that military campaign which led to the overthrow of the Taliban, more than any other country, including members of NATO, gave us. They gave us something called the Northern Alliance, which was a fighting force that the Soviet Union had left in Afghanistan after the Soviet Army withdrew in 1989, continued to train. They gave it to us to fight for us. It took a lot of the casualties that American soldiers would have took. They gave us overflight rights to supply our troops. They gave us their intelligence, which was still very good. They'd been in Afghanistan for decades and decades. They did so much to help the United States that the Kremlin, Putin, believed that as a result, in return, at last, the American-Russian partnership of equals that had been denied Moscow after the end of the Soviet Union in the 1990s would at last be forthcoming. That Russia had proved itself a worthy partner. And what happened? Do you remember what Bush did? No. Well, he expanded NATO a second time, even closer to Russia, bringing in more countries that had once been in the Soviet bloc. And he unilaterally withdrew from the ABM treaty. You remember the anti-ballistic missile treaty? For Russia, that was the bedrock of their national security. because it prohibited missile defense of the kind we're now hell-bent on building. This was what Putin and Medvedev meant when they said we've been repeatedly deceived and betrayed. And then finally in August 2008, no matter how much Bush and Rice and Cheney denied it, Putin and Medvedev still believe that in some way we encouraged and supported Saakashvili's attack on the Russian peacemakers in Georgia. I don't know the truth. And they're not going to tell us, of course. Maybe you can get freedom of information. I don't know how that works. So the Russians are badly bruised. And so when they say, we did not create the necessity for the reset, you did, they have a strong case. And certainly they sincerely believe it. The Obama administration, on the other hand, denies all of this. Hasn't given an inch on any of these issues. Hasn't said we're sorry. And has continued to blame only Putin. And still worse, in blaming Putin, they've kind of insulted him repeatedly. I don't know if you remember that when Obama made his first trip to Russia, about 6 months after he was elected, protocol did call for him to meet with Medvedev, who's the president, Putin's the prime minister. But it didn't require him to say, I look forward to meeting President Medvedev, because Putin is a man with one foot in the Cold War. He said that publicly. That was bad. Particularly bad since the Russian political class does not support Medvedev. It supports Putin. And it really pissed them off. And they've done that in other ways along the way. So this kind of blame Putin for everything that's bad, that we ourselves did at least part of, has been passed on from Clinton to Bush to Obama. And it makes the reset fragile, because if you can't agree on what happened yesterday, you're unlikely to cooperate tomorrow. Any of us. And that's particularly true of states. Of course, we have policymakers who don't believe in history. They have no historical memory whatsoever. They live in a state of constant either historical stupor or amnesia or some kind of narcomania. They have no memory of history. The Russians never forget anything. And they think about it and they brood about it every day. Probably both afflictions are bad, but we really ought to have some sense of what they're talking about, some memory of what happened only 15, 20 years ago, and we don't. Secondly, the reset, apart from the personal supporters of Obama and Medvedev, has almost no political support in either country, in Moscow or Washington. I did recently a collection of the attacks on Obama for the reset, and they're really beyond, they're just unspeakable. The Washington Post, the Weekly Standard, the New Republic, they basically say Obama's betrayed our allies, he's exhibited weakness. One person called it a new Nazi-Soviet pact. I mean, he has no support for this other than his inner group. And Medvedev has no support for the reset in Moscow. If you think there's no freedom of speech in Russia, consider this. About 3 weeks ago, a general published in a very widely circulated Russian newspaper the charge that the Americans stood behind Medvedev, that he was a stooge of the United States, who had been planted in the Kremlin to preserve American control of Europe. So both leaders are essentially being accused of traitorous policies for the reset. Still worse, they're both weak leaders. Both of them are on the ropes. Neither is guaranteed a second term. If one or both goes in 2012, it's far from clear that one or the other's successor will support the reset. And the political class knows this. It's not afraid of either of them, to the degree that people in Washington and in Moscow have been sabotaging the reset. This is a separate story, but it's very obvious. It's stunning in some ways. They just aren't afraid of the leaders, these two guys. Or they don't think they're going to be around long enough to do anything about it. So this policy, as valuable and important as it is very fragile politically. Then finally, even the, not finally, but even the one claim that the reset has, the new nuclear reductions agreement, is terribly fragile. First of all, it isn't new. We had them for 45 years. But it's good, but it's fragile. I don't know whether you know this, but in order to get the Senate, had never before refused to ratify a nuclear reduction treaty. To ratify it, Obama had to write a letter to the Senate promising that he would max out on missile defense in Europe. He had promised the Russians he wouldn't. The Russians see this as another broken promise by an American president. So Obama might have on the telephone winked a few times at Medvedev, like, pay no attention, I got to tell these clowns this to get this treaty ratified. The problem is that if you go back and read the Senate resolution of ratification, it calls for a full implementation of all 4 stages of missile defense, which means putting sights on Russia's borders. And Russia has said repeatedly that if any sights are built on its borders, it's going to withdraw from this treaty. Well, you say, how can you withdraw from a treaty? Well, George Bush did, didn't he? The ABM treaty. So we set that precedent too. This treaty, I fear, is not going to last, or it's not going to be implemented, because missile defense is going to kill it as long as we insist, as the Senate does, and apparently Obama's decided, as he usually does, to go along, to implement this thing. Then there's the whole problem of the expansion of NATO to Russia's borders. No country, reset or not, that feels itself threatened by a foreign military alliance encroaching into its security space is ever going to be a partner of that alliance, period. Anybody with the slightest bit of common sense knows this. You are not going to have a strategic partnership with Russia so long as the American-led NATO is ringing Russia with NATO-American military bases, which continues. Airstrips are being built as we talk. Mobile artillery is being moved from Germany to Bulgaria and Romania, all that. That was Rumsfeld's idea. But Obama seemed to like it. He didn't stop it. And there's even a larger problem, which I bet you haven't thought about. But I ask you to. But it is heresy. The Russians have said, particularly under Putin, and this is why we say he's a very bad man, that they are entitled to what they call a sphere of privileged interest in the former Soviet territories. You remember that in addition to Russia, there were 14 republics of the Soviet Union, and they all became separate independent states after December 1991. So these 14 states, which ring Russia, were part of the Soviet Union. Moscow said, we have privileged security interest here. We have certain rights here. And we want Washington to acknowledge what they call this sphere of privileged interest. Washington's reaction is, screw you. You can't have it. Nobody can have a sphere of influence in the world today because it's an evil remnant of the 19th century. It's not democratic. It's not just. It's not fair to other countries. Well, we all probably say that's so. There's only one problem with this. That, of course, the expansion of NATO to Russia's former zone of security is probably the single most dramatic and expansive extension of the American sphere of influence in the history of the United States. I mean, in just a few years, we've expanded our sphere of influence. What else is NATO? And it's not just military equipment. It's music. They have to buy their weapons from our people. It's our food. Their women date our men. It's a vast expansion of America's sphere of influence by any standard, all through Eastern Europe to Russia's borders. And Russia says, of course, this is hypocrisy of the worst sort, and we aren't going to stand for it, but there's not much they can do about it. So the reset's going to go nowhere when we have this conflict over who's entitled to a sphere of influence. So that brings me, on that note, is there a way out? Can the reset, I don't even like the word reset because a watch can be turned forward or backward, but can, it used to be called détente, but can an American policy of improving relations with Russia so we can achieve the necessary strategic relationship with Russia for our own national security, can a way out be found. The basic problem, the basic institutionalized problem, is, of course, NATO expansion and the projection of America's sphere of influence into Russia's backyard. This is the rock-bed, institutionalized legacy of unwise policy since the end of the Soviet Union made in Washington, and continued, I fear, by the Obama administration. We begin to cope with this by, first of all, understanding what Russia's complaint is. Just listening. We don't listen. Secondly, we have to abandon three myths that are so dear to us, we keep teaching them to our children. We did not win the Cold War. The Cold War ended sometime, if it did end, between 1988 and 1990, 2 full years before the Soviet Union ended. This conflation of the end of the Soviet Union with the end of the Cold War, which has become part of the American triumphalist narrative, and we now write into our textbooks, is false. It didn't happen. And even Reaganites will tell you it didn't happen. It's just something that the first Bush later made up in his campaign against Clinton to try to hold on to the White House. And the media picked it up and said, yeah, it's so, and it's been with us ever since. We won the Cold War. We have to abandon this because the Russians don't see it this way, and they never will. Second is, we have to abandon this notion that we are now the only superpower. You've all heard that. There are no longer any superpowers. The world is different. The world is reinventing itself in terms of the use of power. Anyway, if we were still a superpower in the conventional sense, we would not be bogged down in 2 wars we cannot possibly win. We would not be defied by a puny state like Iran. We would not be enmeshed in the worst economic crisis in 3 generations. And the top contenders for the heavyweight boxing championship of the world would not all be former Soviet citizens. They used to be Americans, remember? We used to identify the heavyweight championship with our superpower. Moreover, we're really considered lucky when we managed to get to the final round of the World Basketball Championships, which we didn't for 3 years in a row. So the superpower stuff is for children. And it's even dangerous for children because they'll grow up into adults who will believe it. The other myth is that Russia needs us to be a great power. This is nonsense. Unreported in the American press is that today 2 bilateral relationships are much more important to Moscow than its relationship with Moscow. That's its relationship with Beijing and its relationship with Berlin. These are Russia's 2 most important partners in the world today. Everything except nuclear security they can get from Berlin and China. They don't need us. They don't need our know-how, our investment, our technology, our political advice. But they do need the nuclear security, and we need their nuclear security. Which brings us back to the essential partnership. One problem is that Obama has continued this tradition of American presidents looking for a friend in the Kremlin. They should be looking for a partner, not a friend. You remember, I think, that Nixon and Brezhnev said they were friends. Remember that? They hung out together, they gave each other cars. They actually liked each other. They were a lot alike. Clinton and Yeltsin, 2 big beefy guys from the provinces, they said they were really friends. Old Bill and old Boris, you remember that? And the second Bush looked in Putin's soul and said he saw a friend of America. And yet, through all these personal friendships, the relationship got worse and worse. It's not about having a friend in the Kremlin. It's about having a partner in Russia who has support in the Russian political class and who will defend the partnership not because they like it, but because it's in Russia's interest. The same way why we should defend the partnership. Not because we think Medvedev is cute and Putin isn't, but because it's essential to our national security. But finally, what do we do then about this biggest problem of NATO expansion and the spheres of influence? And my proposal requires a compromise on both sides. So far as I know, no American has ever advocated it in public, except me. It was not popular and isn't likely to be. I think most fair-minded Americans would agree that Russia does in fact have one privileged interest in its own neighborhood, and that's the absence of foreign military bases. I think we'd say that's reasonable. Why would we say it? Because we're sensible, fair-minded people, but also because we went to the brink of nuclear war in 1962 to defend that right for the United States against Soviet nuclear weapons in Cuba. We were prepared to go to nuclear war to defend the principle that there could not be foreign military bases in our sphere of security, right? Right? So why shouldn't the Russians feel just as tense about this? And why shouldn't we understand that they don't want a bunch of Cubas along their borders? What's the solution? Well, it's twofold, and it's rather simple. Washington announces that NATO expansion is over, no more. I mean, there's no more place to expand to anyway, unless you're going to bring Afghanistan in. And more likely, NATO is going to die in Afghanistan. But it's over. It's finished. Make up any excuse you want. You know, remember Phil Oakes? The war's over. NATO expansion is over. That's it. But that still leaves all these military bases, NATO bases, in Russia's backyard. And here, this requires a major American accommodation. All American and NATO troops east of Germany should be withdrawn. We cannot expel these countries from NATO, these 12 or 15 countries we brought into NATO. But when we took them in, we told the Russians that there would be no military bases in these countries, and we broke that promise. We can now honor that promise and withdraw NATO and American troops from all the NATO countries east of Germany. It would not violate NATO's collective security pledge. Well, they'd still be bound to defend each other if attacked. But it would end the military encirclement of Russia. And I think Russia then would be ready for a real partnership. In return, Russia needs, publicly or by treaty, to acknowledge the political sovereignty of all these countries that were formerly part of the Soviet Union. If they want to elect a crackpot like Saakashvili, Russia's just going to have to live with it and stop trying to overthrow it. And that's true in Belarus and the Baltics and Ukraine and Central Asia, wherever. Grow up and live with it. If these two great nuclear powers took this step, we would have the security we want, and we would have a partner to do the three things we need done: control of these vast nuclear arsenals, real vigilance against the proliferation of radioactive material, because it's seeping out of Russia. It's a Walmart of this stuff. And a real alliance to combat terrorism. Russia's become the main target of terrorism today. You know, they want this partnership very much. We've become a little complacent since nothing big's happened since 9/11, but it will. It will, of course, eventually. But Russia's being hit practically every month. Horrible things. Most recently, the airport was blown, as you know. Neither America nor Russia has anything to lose from such an accommodation, which should have taken place when the Soviet Union ended. And it has, both sides have everything to gain. So I'll end by saying that when you've been doing what I do, talking about Russia, for as long as I have, people always say, I don't like it. They always say, are you an optimist or a pessimist about our relationship? And I finally have thought of an answer, which was given to me by Russians. Because when you ask a Russian if they're optimist or they're a pessimist about world affairs, they always say, well, I'm an optimist. But of course, an optimist is an uninformed pessimist. And I will leave the rest of it to our discussion. Sorry about leaning into the mic. Dan, should I do it myself? Just point to people myself?
You got a mic, but yes.
Well, I'll keep it. I know I was close to it because I can't see my notes. I lean forward. I warned you on the phone. Oh, good, good. Well, we'll see if we can hear me. Go ahead. We'll start on the left. That would be my wife, but we'll start over here. Go ahead. Yes, ma'am.
This is what.
I'm just curious, taking the naive, if you were to email Obama with what you said, what would stop them from implementing your good ideas?
My marriage endures because the ban my wife has put on me not to express my opinion about American politics or Obama. She lifted it, she said, right. I mean, you know, presidents are isolated people. They're really isolated. I don't know what Obama watches other than basketball games. That's what I watch too, and I hope he watches a lot. I love basketball. I guess he probably doesn't read much more than these briefing books that he's given. And somebody prepares them. And the somebodies who prepare them, are they honest brokers? Do they give him all opinions? If they did, the idea I just proposed to you cannot get on the op-ed page of the New York Times or the Washington Post. It's rejected. It's rejected. Somebody has to take the idea to him and say, Mr. President, this is a chance for you to do something historic at no cost, and it'll have great benefit for the United States. Just like what Reagan was told. And believe me, Reagan wasn't a quick learner. It took a long while for Reagan to grasp what was waiting for him in Moscow. Possibility to end the arms race. But we know, we're pretty certain, given these people around Obama, that nobody says such a thing to him. Now you might say, well, he's a smart guy, he ought to be able to think of it by himself. But he's sitting up there, and I'm sure he's up to 3 packs a day, though his wife swears he stopped smoking. Badly stressed over so many other things. I mean, the economy, which is not good. The war in Afghanistan, which is worse. The possibility of his re-election, which is problematic. When does somebody say to him, this really has to be given priority, and here's the way out? It appears in recent history that presidents who have turned around have been gotten to with heretical ideas from somebody in their personal entourage, a family member or a sleeper on their staff, and who's gotten to them and gotten their ear and persuaded them. We don't have any evidence, at least in my field of Russian affairs, that any such person is within, what's the distance between New York, 400 miles of Obama. And the people around him on national security policy really are not, I mean, I'm sure they're very fine people, but they're not good advisors. They're not good advisors.
Dr. Cohen, regarding NATO's military intervention in the old Yugoslavia.
Persist.
Regarding NATO's military intervention in the old Yugoslavia, I mean, ostensibly it was to counteract the Serbian genocide. A, do you believe that was the reason for the intervention? And B, what would have been your prescription? I mean, I think you intimated that you disapproved of that intervention. What would have been your prescription in light of the fact that the Soviets were ineffectual in convincing their Serbian allies?
Well, I think we know more about why the Clinton administration decided on the bombing than we knew at the time. In the memoirs of Strobe Talbot, called The Russia Hand, he was Clinton's advisor. In Clinton's memoirs, and a couple others, the genocide issue, of course, was always the reason we gave. Now, if you could find 3 people who are specialists on the subject to tell you what genocide is, be my guest. I mean, everybody's got a different understanding of genocide. But there had been ethnic killing in this area, and not only about Milosevic, ever since the end of this, as you point out, the end of Yugoslavia. I mean, it was a bloodlands. Did that warrant this kind of use of air power against a country? And by the way, it wasn't taking place in Serbia. They weren't bombing Milosevic's troops in Kosovo. They were bombing Serbia. It's unusual to bomb a European capital in modern times. I'm not sure when the last bombing of a European capital was.
In World War II.
Well, yeah, I know about World War II, but I mean since World War II. This was a pretty dramatic thing for the United States to do. The United States wanted to be rid of Milosevic, that's clear. They wanted to pain the Serbs into removing Milosevic. But there was a way to do that without bombing, and that was to let the Russians handle it. Let the Russians handle it. Well, we had a hold on the Russians that's never discussed, but there were many wealthy Russians in the Russian government, and their accounts were in the West. In fact, I think that's how we finally got them to hand Milosevic over. After Milosevic fell from power, he wasn't taken to The Hague right away. Chernomyrdin, who was the Russian prime minister, was brought in to do this. He was like one of the 8 richest men in the world, and he wasn't keeping his money in Russian banks. We had a lot of influence in Moscow. I think also the Clinton administration, somewhat frustrated by it, wanted to show the use of American power. And who was running NATO? Who was running NATO? And also that NATO would now be, and this was maybe the most dangerous part of it, an alternative international decision-making body to the United Nations. Because stop and think, I mean, as a member of the United Nations, to take what was essentially a police action, we were supposed to run this past the Security Council. The Russians, of course, would have vetoed it. But we then made an argument that NATO was a legitimate international collective security organization of equal standing with the United Nations. This, of course, was something very new. We never claimed that for NATO before. So I think there were different motives, and I don't think anything good ever came out of it. And if you look at Kosovo today, and by the way, the first thing that Putin did when he recognized the 2 breakaway republics of Georgia, and we went ballistic and said, you can't chip off a piece of a state and give them independence, he went, no, Kosovo, no, Kosovo. I mean, because he said at the time, the Russians said at the time, that it was the first example of the redrawing of post-World War II borders in Europe, and that it would be a dangerous precedent. Remember, Spain was against it because there are Basque and other ethnic groups that want to break away. Lots of countries didn't like what we did. And by the way, I don't think all the countries have recognized Kosovo. I think there's like only about 80. A lot of people are still worried about this carving out of the nations. But the story certainly wasn't simple as the one. And I hate to say it, but I mean, this was supported from left and right pretty much. I mean, almost, other than the Nation magazine and a handful of lonely voices, the whole political establishment in this country supported the bombing. And nobody's apologizing for it. So
What would, Part B, what would have been your prescription, or?
well, it depends on what your goal was. If your goal was to send Milosevic to stop the killing in Kosovo, then you turn to the Russians. If it was to get Milosevic to step down, that would have been asking too much of the Russians. But if you got the first, the pretext of genocide was over.
Excuse me, but you remember the Russians in Kosovo, and were not doing anything about it. They had people in Kosovo.
You're talking about after the American bombing?
Before, they
Before
dragged
the
it.
Well, what did you expect them to do? What were they supposed to do?
So what do you expect the West to do?
Well, it wasn't the West, it was the United States. Let's be clear about something here. It was pretty much a unilateral Washington decision. I expect the United States not to go around bombing capitals in order to achieve a foreign policy purpose that is a little murky. The Russian role in all of this meant Yeltsin's role. We had Yeltsin so badly in a vice, that he had no room for maneuver. If you read Talbot's memoirs, at the very time that Clinton was saying how Yeltsin was the George Washington of Russia, taking him to Hyde Park, putting his arm around him, he was telling Talbot, and I quote, "I guess I'm going to have to shove some more shit up old Boris's mouth tonight. But he'll learn to swallow it like he always does." I think that we don't know the whole truth yet. This is one reason why Yeltsin was, in the end, forced to resign. I don't think he resigned voluntarily. But the scandal, what happened in Serbia, went down so badly there. Now, what the Russians did, remember there was this one episode where they marched on Pricina, remember that? And when the bombing was underway, a Russian legion there marched to the airport called Pricina, right? What's the airport in Kosovo? Pristina. And then the British commander of NATO forces announced to headquarters he was going to attack the Russians. And he didn't give a damn, as he wrote, if it meant World War III. Now, when you think back and look at what was going on there, this was. But of course, stop and think today. Stop and think today. No, let's think before that. We never would have done that had the Soviet Union existed. We couldn't have done it. And we wouldn't do it today either, because Russia's back on its feet. So we took advantage of a weakness to do something we thought was in our interest, but looking back doesn't look to me like it was in our interest. It was a bad precedent. And finally, there are a lot of genocides, if that's what's going to come, going on in the world with the United States isn't doing anything about. Why that one?
Interesting little blurb in the Wall Street Journal today. Supposedly it was a quote from Gorbachev. I don't know if you saw that, but he supposedly said he was ashamed of what was going on in Russia these days, and that if there were not changes, they'd have a Egyptian-style revolution. Is there anything to that?
Which part of it? And they changed it out. They're not going to have an Egyptian style. Not ashamed. I read the interview. The interview came out yesterday, and we got it at home. You have to understand the situation he's in, even though we've forgotten it. He is the father of Russian democracy. From 1989 to 1991, 88 to the end of 1990, he took Russia closer to real functioning democracy than Russia had ever been in its 1,000-year history, period. That's a fact. It isn't easy when you're a historic figure to outlive 20 years the history you made. I mean, it's tough. And it's particularly tough if you see the one thing you thought you achieved going down the drain, the democratization of Russia. And he's talked about this in a low voice and in a kind of nurturing voice, in a kind of grandfatherly voice to the Kremlin for many years. But his alarm is growing, and on March 2nd, he'll be 80 years old. The attention in Moscow is very much on him. That's why he's given all these interviews, because of his birthday. And as you turn 80, I guess, you begin to think about your legacy. And he's worried about it. So I think it's not so much that he's ashamed of what they're doing, he's in despair over what's happened. And more can he persuade himself that the glass is half full. That's what he's been saying. We are halfway, the glass is half full. We've made a half journey to democracy. Takes all countries a long time. We're going to get there. Now I think he thinks the glass is half empty. Now why he changed his mind recently, I don't know if it's age or things that have happened in Russia.
I have a question of reflection. By virtue of living in Russia for 30 years and living in the States now for 3 years, I have equal parts spent in both countries. I would say Russia always will be a difficult partner for the United States and for Western type of democracy. They believe they have their own democracy, but democracy can be only one type. Otherwise, it's not a democracy. Well, you call it different word. What concerns me is that deep mistrust, not only in Russian political class, but also in the Russian population towards the United States. And it's also being nurtured now, this almost patriotism, nationalism, hatred towards foreigners, and most of all I think both countries are at fault for that kind of situation. Now, I don't see any political figure that would bring that political thinking notch above and try to develop some kind of partnership. So my question to you, do you see in any country any figure that possibly can raise above that difficulties that we have?
I agree with your main point, only I would make it bigger. I think the United States is always a difficult partner for Russia, and Russia is always going to be a difficult partner for us. And that even if we establish a partnership, it's going to need nurturing, and there are going to be problems. And it's something about our natures as great, vast frontier countries. It's always been this way, and it's not a bad thing. It's a bad thing if it becomes, you know, a nuclear arms race or something. So I would go further than you and say that this is just going to be built into the relationship, but that doesn't mean we can't have a partnership. I don't think, actually, based on the polls I've seen, that you use the word hatred. I would even say dislike. Remember one thing, the Russians are able to make a distinction that we can't make. When we say the West, we mean the United States. That's our provincial vanity. Russians understand that there is a West in Europe and that the United States is not a European country. So the debate, as you know from living in Russia, is this debate, is Russia part of Europe or not? Then you get the Eurasian argument, well, we're both, and this, and we're not, and it's been going on forever. But nobody in Russia would say we're part of the United States. And the fact is though some of our ancestors were chased out of Europe or fled Europe. We are not Europeans. We are simply not Europeans. We have a different history, different culture. Whereas the Russians share a large part of the European historical culture. I think also that the most dangerous thing in Russia is not the dislike of the West, it's the racism that's running amok because of the civil war in the Caucasus, in the North Caucasus, and the terrorism. Russians have always been racist in their thinking. They've always, you know that. They have no conception of race relations in the United States. They basically think we made a big mistake when we ended segregation. I mean, that's basically how they're thinking about it. Their attitude toward the Chinese is envy and fear, right? But this Chechen, Dagestan, Ingushian problem is really something new. They're afraid of people of color because they think they're carrying bombs. And this racism is spreading now to an ultra-nationalism. Now it cuts two ways, though. One is we need a racial alliance with the white nations in the world against these people. That's coming out of this one wing of the ultra-nationalist movement. The other, of course, is seized the hand of the United States behind all this stuff. The final part is Medvedev, of course, has tried to put himself forward as the man who can play the role. He's become the advocate of Russia's modernization, Western modernization. He has said you can't modernize without democracy, and he's called for what he calls modernizing alliances with the West. So in his vernacular, he's trying to be the guy who's trying to rise above this and lead. And it's good. I mean, we would probably all say, we shake your hand and we wish you well. The problem is politically he's weak. And I think most Russians don't see a leader in him. He doesn't, there's something about him, he's likable and he's this and that, but he doesn't, to an ordinary Russian, he's not a, what they used to call Yeltsin, he's not a mujik. He's not a good old boy, a good guy. I mean, there's something not leader-like about him. Now, he's trying to change that. But his call for modernizing alliances is kind of his way of saying what you're saying needs to be done. And that's what Obama's been told too. His advisors say we got to go with Medvedev. In Russia, he's called, they've adopted this word we have, brand, like a franchise or a brand. And they've said that Medvedev has made the reset his brand in Russia. And in a way, Obama's probably, when told that, is very happy about that. But a president has to think beyond this personal friendship. If Medvedev goes down, does the brand go down in Russia? Now, you've got to build support for this policy in the political class. And so far as I can tell, most of the political class remains loyal to Putin, so far as I can tell. I may be wrong. I mean, nobody can tell for sure. There's a gentleman way in the back who controls the food, so we should let him. He's got all that food under his personal control. We better.
I was wondering if there's evidence for some things like it's not really important. You said Dick Cheney advocated using nuclear bombs in Georgia.
Yeah, I regret that because there were two reports that he had advocated. Advocated means when you have these strategic discussions, we can't rule out the option of nuclear weapons, that kind of thing. But we know for sure, it's been widely reported, that sending NATO American forces, I should take back the thing about the nuclear, but about sending forces is for sure. I mean, there are several sources we can quote, and there's been no denial.
Now, what about the promises the United States broke with respect to the unification of Germany versus moving eastward out of the NATO alliance?
Yeah.
And actually, why did the United States agree to that?
At that point, had Russia withdrawn from Germany?
No. In 1990, Germany was occupied by the four occupying post-war so-called victors, right? The Soviet Union, the United States, France, and Great Britain, correct? There had to be this four-power agreement to reunite Germany. That was the only way Germany could be reunited. Let me remind you of the situation in 1990. Thatcher was against it. Thatcher was against the reunification of Germany. Mitterrand was against the reunification of Germany. I don't have to tell you why, do I? It's on the front page of the New York Times today. Because the European nations are scared to death of this emerging economic political powerhouse called Germany today. The only person who could bring about German reunification was Gorbachev. And Russia lost 27, or to be exact, 26.5 million people in the war against Nazi Germany. That was a hard sell inside the Soviet Union, reunification of Germany. He needed something to take home, and this is what they gave him. By the way, it's in Condi Rice's own book. She was a party to this. She was an aide to Scowcroft at the time, and she later, before becoming Secretary of State, wrote a book on the reunification of Germany, and it's all there. I mean, she tells the story. Genscher, who was the German foreign minister, and Kohl have confirmed it. Baker denies it, but he's lying. He denies it because he's the one who carried the message, and he doesn't want to be on the hook, but everybody else. Former Senator Bradley got interested in this, and he called me up and he said, I want to track this down, and I told him the people to talk to. He talked to all of them, went to Berlin and gave a speech and said it was absolutely true. Gorbachev's folly was not getting it in writing. Let that be a lesson to us. It's called a prenup nowadays. Nobody lets their kids get married anymore without a prenup. So I should have a prenup.
Hi, are Russians aware enough to brood and be bitter about the...
It's because we're both
I think it must be this.
Yeah, the full court press by the Rand Corporation, as Sean Gervasi was talking about. The full court press project of the Reagan administration was by the Rand Corporation to systematically destroy the Soviet Union.
Yeah, this was the one that Kissinger was running, right?
Yeah.
And then they had the CIA. Oh, the Russians knew about it. I mean, there were no secrets on either side. And it bothered them that I don't take it seriously. I don't think they took it seriously. I mean, to me, that Reagan emerged from all that, which he had inspired with the evil empire stuff and the talk about, nuclear war wasn't the worst thing he could think of. That Reagan understood, or was made to understand, that Gorbachev was giving him, Reagan, a historic opportunity to end the nuclear arms race, and maybe even the Cold War. That he understood that, and at his age, he was deep in his 70s, I believe, at the end of, right, in his presidency, And with his own political base rather wobbly, he didn't have the popularity in the party or in the nation he had had before. He decided to give it a shot with Gorbachev and leave all that craziness behind. To my way of thinking, that's when you recognize somebody's become a great leader, when they've transcended themselves. They've become something other than what they were before. Some people think Lyndon Johnson was on the way of becoming that with the civil rights laws, outgrowing his Southern political biography until he got bogged down in Vietnam and wrecked it all. I don't know. But Gorbachev had grown up in the Orthodox Soviet nomenclature his whole life. Where did he come from? Where did this guy whose every political moment of his life was in this nomenclature, this Communist Party bureaucracy, and then emerges and said, we're going to end the Cold War and we're going to democratize the country? Well, what was that all about? One thing Reagan and Gorbachev had in common is they hated nuclear weapons. And they equally hated what was supposed to keep us safe, the so-called doctrine of MAD. You remember that? Mutual assured destruction. That we won't attack you because we know if we do, you'll completely destroy us, and vice versa. Reagan used to say that's obscene. He said God doesn't like that. And Gorbachev thought it was madness to be living on that razor's edge. And why is it, tell me this, about American politicians, that when Obama decided he was going to get a Nobel Prize by announcing that he was going to strive for a nuclear-free world, he neglected to mention that Gorbachev and Reagan had announced that goal 20 years before him. I mean, what's with these people? That we're all born yesterday. But it's very important to acknowledge the people who came before you and honor them. Reagan and Gorbachev called for a world without nuclear weapons, and they remain to this day the only two leaders to have ever abolished an entire category of nuclear weapons, the intermediate range missiles. Remember that in 1987? So when all these guys go on about abolishing nuclear weapons and blah, 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 I say no, let's build on what the people before you achieved. Let's go back and see what went wrong. Why didn't that process continue? So, you know, Reagan's 100th birthday and Gorbachev's 80th birthday, there's going to be a lot of comment on this. Those two guys have entered history together, like it or not. I just want there's somebody over here. No, we done. Yeah, go ahead.
But Dr. Cohen, haven't we been...
Please don't call me doctor. I stopped taking out doing appendicitis operations many years ago. Dr. Cohen was
Dr. White.
Dr. Cohen was my uncle. Go ahead. Go fashion.
Stephen.
By the way, when I got my PhD, my elderly aunt said to me, all those years you couldn't be a real doctor. Jewish wisdom.
Stephen, you know, but haven't we been sold a historical bill of goods? Wasn't the Soviet structure collapsing internally, and either Reagan or the CIA or any American intelligence, despite the fact they spent billions, if not trillions of dollars to try to get this information, weren't aware of it or were oblivious to it. And to it, I mean, Gorbachev was deposed soon after by quote-unquote Democratic or more democratic forces. So isn't it true that it would have happened regardless of Reagan and Gorbachev?
Whenever anybody asks you a question again, isn't it true? It's a very good guess, it isn't. I have to be faithful to myself. I wrote a whole book on that subject. It's right over there. 2 chapters are devoted to why the Soviet Union ended. No, the Soviet Union wasn't collapsing. The Soviet Union was about as stable as any country could have been until Gorbachev came to power. And if Gorbachev hadn't come to power or a Gorbachev figure, we'd still be dealing with the Soviet Union today. Period, end of story.
But it was corrupt. Their war in Afghanistan brought them down.
Yeah.
I'm not talking about...
More corrupt than what? They were terrible. They weren't as corrupt as the system is today, even by their own. By the way, let me tell you an interesting little tidbit. There are about 2 polling agencies in Russia that don't cook the results today. That you get pretty honest survey polling from. both recently published a poll that showed that Russians of all ages today, I mean that means 18 to retirement age, agree that Soviet-era bureaucrats were more honest, more efficient, and more patriotic than today's Russian bureaucrats. That's where things have come to. That's stunning, but, comma, people 18 want to become Russian bureaucrats as a profession because you can make a lot of money.
Okay, on that note, let me just point out that we have a couple of the books here, so if you want, please come see me.
Thank you all very much. I give you back all three of your mics. There you go. Never had so many mics.
Well, here we have the moon, and if you look sideways, there is the French poodle with his cute little feet. On the upper half of the moon. And I'll attempt to focus it better. Automatic focus. And there it is with other settings. That's manual focus. Here's a darker version.